Chapter 18. So much of the story of Achilles to Telemachus, the son of Odysseus, hear from the lips of King Menelaus, as he sat with his comrade Pisistratus in the king's feasting hall. And more would Menelaus have told them than if Helen, his wife, had not been seen to weep. "Why weepest thou, Helen?" said Menelaus. "Ah, surely I know it is because the words that tell of the death of Hector are sorrowful to thee." And Helen, the lovely lady, said, "Never did Prince Hector speak a hard or a harsh word to me in all the years I was in his father's house. And if anyone upbraided me, he would come and speak gentle words to me. Ah, greatly did I lament for the death of noble Hector. After his wife and his mother, I wept the most for him. And when one speaks of his slaying, I cannot help but weep." Said Menelaus, "Relieve your heart of its sorrow, Helen, by praising Hector to this youth, and by telling your memories of him." "Tomorrow I shall do so," said the lady Helen. She went with her maids from the hall, and the servants took Telemachus and Pisistratus to their sleeping places. The next day they sat in the banqueting hall. King Menelaus and Telemachus and Pisistratus, and the lady Helen came amongst them. Her handmaidens brought into the hall her silver work-basket that had wheels beneath it with rims of gold, and her golden distaff that, with the basket, had been presents from the wife of the king of Egypt. And Helen sat in her chair and took the distaff in her hands and worked on the violet-colored wool that was in her basket. And as she worked, she told Telemachus of Troy and of its guardian Hector. Said Helen, "The old men were at the gate of the city talking over many things, and King Priam was amongst them. It was in the days when Achilles first quarreled with King Agamemnon. 'Come hither, my daughter,' said King Priam to me, 'and sit by me and tell me who the warriors are who now come out upon the plain. You have seen them all before, and I would have you tell me who such and such a one is. Who is yon hero who seems so mighty? I have seen men who were more tall than he by a head, but I have never seen a man who looked more royal.' I said to King Priam, 'The hero whom you look upon is the leader of the host of the Greeks. He is the renowned King Agamemnon. He looks indeed a king and Priam. Tell me now who the other warrior is who is shorter by a head than King Agamemnon, but who is broader of chest and shoulder.' 'He is Odysseus,' I said, 'who is reared in rugged Ithaca, but who is wise above all the kings.' And an old man, Atenor, who was by us, said, 'That indeed is Odysseus. I remember that he and Menelaus came on an embassy to the assembly of the Trojans. When they both stood up, Menelaus seemed the greater man. But when they sat down, Odysseus seemed by far the most stately. When they spoke in the assembly, Menelaus was ready and skillful of speech. Odysseus, when he spoke, held his staff stiffly in his hands and fixed his eyes on the ground. We thought by the look of him then that he was a man of no understanding. But when he began to speak, we saw that no one could match Odysseus. His words came like snowflakes in winter, and his voice was very resonant. And Priam said, 'Who is that huge warrior? I think he is taller and broader than any of the rest.' 'He is great Aias,' I said, 'who is as a bulwark of the Greeks, and beside him stands Idomeneus, who has come from the island of Crete. Around him stand the Cretan captains.' So I spoke, but my heart was searching for a sight of my own two brothers. I did not see them in any of the companies. Had they come with the host, I wondered, and were they ashamed to be seen with the warriors on account of my wrongdoing? I wondered as I looked for them. I did not know that even then my two dear brothers were dead, and that the earth of their own dear land held them. Hector came to the gate, and the wives and daughters of the Trojans came running to him, asking for news of their husbands or sons or brothers, whether they were killed or whether they were coming back from the battle. He spoke to them all and went to his own house, but Andromache, his wife, was not there. And the house dame told him that she had gone to the great tower by the wall of the city to watch the battle, and that the nurse had gone with her, bringing their infant child. So Hector went down the street and came to the gate where we were, and Andromache, his wife, came to meet him. With her was the nurse who carried the little child that the folk of the city called Astyanax, calling him king of the city, because his father was their city's protector. Hector stretched out his arms to the little boy whom the nurse carried, but the child shrank away from him, because he was frightened of the great helmet on his father's head with its horsehair crest. Then Hector laughed, and Andromache laughed with him. And Hector took off his great helmet and laid it on the ground. Then he took up his little son and dandled him in his arms and prayed, "O Zeus, greatest of the gods, grant that this son of mine may become valiant, and that, like me, he may be protector of the city, and thereafter a great king, so that men may say of him as he returns from battle, 'Far greater is he than was Hector his father.'" Saying this, he left the child back in his nurse's arms. And to Andromache, his wife, who that day was very fearful, he said, "Dear one, do not be over sorrowful. You urge me not to go every day into the battle, but some days to stay behind the walls. But my own spirit forbids me to stay away from the battle, for always I have taught myself to be valiant and to fight in the forefront." So he said, and he put on his helmet again and went to order his men. And his wife went towards the house, looking back at him often and letting her tears fall down. Thou knowest from Menelaus' story what triumphs Hector had thereafter, how he drove the Greeks back to their ships and affrighted them with his 1,000 watchfires upon the plain. How he drove back the host that Agamemnon led when Diomedes and Odysseus and Machaon the healer were wounded. How he broke through the wall that the Greeks had builded and brought fire to their ships, and how he slew Patroclus in the armor of Achilles. 19. King Priam on his tower saw Achilles come raging across the plain. And he cried out to Hector, "Hector, beloved son, do not wait this man's onset, but come within the city's walls. Come within that thou mayest live and be a protection to the men and women of Troy. Come within that thou mayest save thy father, who must perish if thou art slain." But Hector would not come within the walls of the city. He stood holding his shield against a jutting tower in the wall, and all around him were the Trojans, who came pouring in through the gate without waiting to speak to each other, to ask who were yet living and who were slain. And as he stood there, he was saying in his heart, "The fault is mine that the Trojans have been defeated upon the plain. I kept them from entering the city last night against the counsel of a wise man. For in my pride I thought it would be easy to drive Achilles and the Greeks back again and defeat them utterly and destroy their hopes of return. Now are the Trojans defeated and dishonored, and many have lost their lives through my pride. Now the women of Troy will say, 'Hector, by trusting to his own might, has brought destruction upon the whole host, and our husbands and sons and brothers have perished because of him.' Rather than hear them say this, I shall face Achilles and slay him and save the city, or if it must be, perish by his spear." When Achilles came near him, Hector spoke to him and said, "My heart bids me stand against thee, although thou art a mightier man than I. But before we go into battle, let us take pledges one from the other, with the gods to witness, that if I should slay thee, I shall strip thee of thine armor, but I shall not carry thy body into the city, but shall give it to thine own friends to treat with all honor, and that if thou shouldst slay me, thou shalt give my body to my friends." But Achilles said, "Between me and thee there can be no pledges. Fight, and fight with all thy soldiership, for now I strive to make thee pay for all the sorrow thou hast brought to me because of the slaying of Patroclus my friend." He spoke and raised his spear and flung it, but with his quickness Hector avoided Achilles' spear, and he raised his own, saying, "Thou hast missed me, and not yet is the hour of my doom. Now it is thy turn to stand before my spear." He flung it, but the wonderful shield of Achilles turned Hector's spear, and it fell on the ground. Then was Hector downcast, for he had no other spear. He drew his sword and sprang at Achilles. But the helmet and shield of Achilles let none of Hector's great strokes touch his body. And Achilles got back into his hands his own great spear, and he stood guarding himself with his shield and watching Hector for a spot to strike him on. Now in the armor that Hector wore, the armor that he had stripped off Patroclus, there was a point at the neck where there was an opening. As Hector came on Achilles, drove at his neck with his spear and struck him, and Hector fell in the dust. Then Achilles stripped from him the armor that Patroclus had worn. The other captains of the Greeks came up and looked at Hector where he lay, and all marveled at his size and strength and goodliness. And Achilles dragged the body at his chariot and drove away towards the ships. Hector's mother, standing on the tower of the wall, saw all that was done, and she broke into a great cry. And all the women of Troy took up the cry and wailed for Prince Hector, who had guarded them and theirs from the foe. Andromache, his wife, did not know the terrible thing that had happened. She was in an inner chamber of Hector's house, weaving a great web of cloth, embroidering it with flowers. And she had ordered her handmaidens to heat water for the bath, so that Hector might refresh himself when he came in from the fight. But now she heard the wail of the women of Troy. Fear came upon her, for she knew that such wailing was for the best of their warriors. She ran from her chamber and out into the street and came to the battlements where the people stood watching. She saw the chariot of Achilles dashing off towards the ships, and she knew that it dragged the dead body of Hector. Then darkness came before her eyes, and she fainted away. Her husband's sisters and his brothers' wives thronged round her and lifted her up, and at last her life came back to her, and she wailed for Hector. "O my husband," she cried, "for misery were we two born. Now thou hast been slain by Achilles, and I am left husbandless. And ah, woe for our young child! Hard-hearted strangers shall oppress him when he lives amongst people that care not for him or his. And he will come weeping to me, his widowed mother, who will live forever, sorrowful thinking upon where thou liest, Hector, by the ships of those who slew thee." Chapter 20. Now that Hector was dead, King Priam, his father, had only one thought in his mind, and that was to get his body from Achilles and bring it into the city, so that it might be treated with the honor befitting the man who had been the guardian of Troy. And while he sat in his grief, thinking of his noble son lying so far from him, from those who would have wept over him, behold, there appeared before him Iris, the messenger of Zeus, the greatest of the gods. Iris said to him, "King, thou mayest ransom from Achilles the body of Hector thy noble son. Go thou thyself to the hut of Achilles, and bring with thee 3 gifts to offer him. Take with thee a wagon, and thou mayest bring back in it the body, and let only one old henchman go with thee to drive the mules." Then Priam, when he heard this, arose and went into his treasure chamber, and took out of his chest 12 beautiful robes, 12 bright-colored cloaks, 12 soft coverlets, and 10 talents of gold. He took 4 cauldrons and 2 tripods, and a wonderful goblet that the men of Thrace had given him when they had come on an embassy to his city. Then he called upon his sons, and he bade them make ready the wagon and load it with the treasures he had brought out of his treasure chamber. When the wagon was loaded and the mules were yoked under it, and when Priam and his henchmen had mounted the seats, Hecabe the queen, Priam's wife and the mother of Hector, came with wine and with a golden cup, that they might pour out an offering to the gods before they went on their journey, that they might know whether the gods indeed favored it, or whether Priam himself was not going into danger. King Priam took the cup from his wife, and he poured out wine from it, and looking towards heaven, he prayed, "O Father Zeus, grant that I may find welcome under Achilles' roof, and send, if thou wilt, a bird of omen, so that seeing it with mine own eyes, I may go on my way, trusting that no harm will befall me." He prayed, and straightway a great eagle was seen, with wide wings spread out above the city. And when they saw the eagle, the hearts of the people were glad, for they knew that their king would come back safely, and with the body of Prince Hector, who had guarded Troy. Now Priam and his henchmen drove across the plain of Troy, and came to the river that flowed across, and there they let their mules drink. They were greatly troubled, for dark night was coming down, and they knew not the way to the hut of Achilles. They were in fear, too, that some company of armed men would come upon them and slay them for the sake of the treasures that had in the wagon. The henchman saw a young man coming towards them, and when he reached them, he spoke to them kindly and offered to guide them through the camp and to the hut of Achilles. He mounted the wagon and took the reins in his hand and drove the mules. He brought them to the hut of Achilles and helped Priam from the wagon and carried the gifts they had brought within the hut. "Know, King Priam," he said, "that I am not a mortal, but that I am one sent by Zeus to help and companion thee upon the way. Go now within the hut and speak to Achilles, and ask him for his father's sake to restore to thee the body of Hector thy son." So he spoke and departed, and King Priam went within the hut. There great Achilles was sitting, and King Priam went to him and knelt before him and clasped the hands of the man who had slain his son. And Achilles wondered when he saw him there, for he did not know how one would have come to his hut and entered it without being seen. He knew then that it was one of the gods who had guided this man. Priam spoke to him and said, "Bethink thee, Achilles, upon thine own father. He is now of an age with me, and perhaps even now in thy faraway country. There are those who make him suffer pain and misery. But however great the pain and misery he may suffer, he is happy compared to me, for he knows that thou, his son, art still alive. But I no longer have him who is the best of my sons. Now, for thy father's sake, have I come to thee. Achilles asked for the body of Hector, my son. I am more pitiable than my father or than any man, for I have come through dangers to take in my hand the hands that slew my son." Achilles remembered his father and felt sorrow for the old man who knelt before him. He took King Priam by the hand and raised him up and seated him on the bench beside him. And he wept, remembering old Peleus, his father. He called his handmaids, and he bade them take the body of Hector and wash it and wrap it in two of the robes that Priam had brought. When they had done all this, he took up the body of Hector and laid it himself upon the wagon. Then he came and said to King Priam, "Thy son is laid upon a bier, and at the break of day thou mayest bring him back to the city, but now eat and rest here for this night." King Priam and he looked at Achilles, and he saw how great and how goodly he was. And Achilles looked at Priam, and he saw how noble and how kingly he looked. And this was the first time that Achilles and Priam, the king of Troy, really saw each other. When they gazed on each other, King Priam said, "When thou goest to lie down, Lord Achilles, permit me to lie down also. Not once have my eyelids closed in sleep since my son Hector lost his life. And now I have tasted bread and meat and wine for the first time since, and I could sleep." Achilles ordered that a bed be made in the portico for King Priam and his henchmen. But before they went, Achilles said, "Tell me, king, and tell me truly, for how many days dost thou desire to make a funeral for Hector? For so many days' space I will keep back the battle from the city, so that thou mayest make the funeral in peace. For 9 days we would watch beside Hector's body and lament for him. On the 10th day we would have the funeral. On the 11th day we would make the burial of him, and on the 12th day we would fight." King Priam said, "Even for 12 days I will hold the battle back from the city," said Achilles. Then Priam and his henchmen went to rest, but in the middle of the night the young man who had guided him to the hut of Achilles, the god Hermes he was, appeared before his bed and bade him arise and go to the wagon and yoke the mules and drive back to the city with the body of Hector. Priam aroused his henchmen, and they went out and yoked the mules and mounted the wagon, and with Hermes to guide them they drove back to the city. And Achilles on his bed thought of his own fate, how he too would die in battle, and how for him there would be no father to make lament, but he would be laid where he had asked his friends to lay him, beside Patroclus. And over them both the Greeks would raise a barrow that would be wondered at in after times. So Achilles thought, and afterwards the arrow fired by Paris struck him as he fought before the gate of the city, and he was slain even on the place where he slew Hector. But the Greeks carried off his body and his armor and brought them back to the ships, and Achilles was lamented over, though not by old Peleus, his father. From the depths of the sea came Thetis, his goddess mother, and with her came the maidens of the sea. They covered the body of Achilles with the wonderful raiment and over it they lamented for 17 days and 17 nights. On the 18th day he was laid in the grave beside Patroclus, his dear friend, and over them both the Greeks raised a barrow that was wondered at in the aftertimes. Chapter 21. Now Hector's sister was the first to see her father coming in the dawn across the plain of Troy, with the wagon upon which his body was laid. She came down to the city, and she cried through the streets, O men and women of Troy, ye who often went to the gates to meet Hector, coming back with victory, come now to the gates to receive Hector dead. Then every man and woman in the city took themselves outside the gate, and they brought in the wagon upon which Hector was laid. And all day from the early dawn to the going down of the sun, they wailed for him who had been the guardian of their city. His father took the body to the house where Hector had lived, and he laid it upon his bed. Then Hector's wife, Telemachus, went to the bed and cried over the body. Husband, she cried, thou art gone from life, and thou hast left me a widow in thy house. Our child is very little, and he shall not grow to manhood in the halls that were thine. For long before that, the city will be taken and destroyed. How can it stand when thou, who wert its best guardian, hast perished? The folk lament thee, Hector, but for me and for thy little son, doomed to grow up amongst strangers and men unfriendly to him, the pain for thy death will ever abide. And Hecabe, Hector's mother, went to the bed and cried, Of all my children, thou, Hector, wert the dearest. Thou wert slain because it was not thy way to play the coward. Ever wert thou championing the men and women of Troy without thought of taking shelter or flight. And for that thou wert slain, my son. And I, Helen, went to the bed too, to lament for noble Hector. Of all the friends I had in Troy, thou wert the dearest Hector. I cried, never did I hear one harsh word from thee to me, who brought wars and troubles to thy city. In every way thou wert as a brother to me, therefore I bewail thee with pain at my heart. For in all Troy there is no one now who is friendly to me. Then did the king and the folk of the city prepare for Hector's funeral. On the 10th day, weeping most bitter tears, they bore brave Hector away, and they made a grave for him, and over the grave they put close-set stones. And over it all they raised a great barrow. On the 11th day they feasted at King Priam's house, and on the 12th day the battle began anew. Chapter 22. For many days Telemachus and his comrade Pisistratus stayed in the house of King Menelaus. On the evening before he departed, Menelaus spoke to him of the famous deeds of his father Odysseus. Now Achilles was dead, said Menelaus, and his glorious armor was offered as a prize for the warrior whom the Greeks thought the most of. 2 men strove for the prize, Odysseus and his friend Aias. To Odysseus the armor of Achilles was given, but he was in no way glad of the prize, for his getting it had wounded the proud spirit of great Aias. It was fitting that Odysseus should have been given Achilles' armor, for no warrior in the host had done better than he. But Odysseus was to do still greater things for us. He knew that only one man could wield a bow better than Paris, who had shot with an arrow Achilles, and who after that had slain many of our chiefs. That man was Philoctetes. He had come with Agamemnon's host to Troy, but Philoctetes had been bitten by a water snake, and the wound given him was so terrible that none of our warriors could bear to be near him. He was left on the island of Lemnos, and the host lost memory of him. But Odysseus remembered, and he took ship to Lemnos and brought Philoctetes back with his great bow and with the arrows of Hercules that were his. Philoctetes shot at Paris upon the wall of Troy and slew him with an arrow. And then Odysseus devised the means by which we took Priam's city at last. He made us build a great wooden horse. We built it and left it upon the plain of Troy, and the Trojans wondered at it greatly. And Odysseus had counseled us to bring our ships down to the water, and to burn our stores, and make it seem in every way that we were going to depart from Troy in weariness. This we did, and the Trojans saw the great host sail away from before their city. But they did not know that a company of the best of our warriors was within the hollow of the wooden horse. nor did they know that we had left a spy behind to make a signal for our return. The Trojans wondered why the great wooden horse had been left behind, and there were some who considered that it had been left there as an offering to the goddess Pallas Athene, and they thought it should be brought within the city. Others were wiser and would have left the wooden horse alone, but those who considered that it should be brought within prevailed, and as the horse was too great to bring through the gate, they flung down part of the wall that they might bring it through. The wooden horse was brought within the walls and left upon the streets and of the city, and the darkness of the night fell. Now Helen, my wife, came down to where the wooden horse was, and she, suspecting there were armed men within, walked around in it 3 times, calling to every captain of the Greeks who might be within his own wife's voice. And when the sound of a voice that had not been heard for so many years came to him, each of the captains started up to answer, but Odysseus put his hands across the mouth of each, and so prevented them from being discovered. We had left a spy hidden between the beach and the city. Now when the wooden horse had been brought within the walls and night had fallen, the spy lighted a great fire that was signal to the ships that had sailed away. They returned with the host before the day broke. Then we who were within the wooden horse broke through the boards and came out on the city with our spears and swords in our hands. The guards beside the gates we slew, and we made a citadel of the wooden horse and fought around it. The warriors from the ships crossed the wall where it was broken down, and we swept through the streets and came to the citadel of the king. Thus we took Priam's city and all its treasures, and thus I won back my own wife, the lovely Helen. But after we had taken and sacked King Priam's city, great troubles came upon us. Some of us sailed away, and some of us remained on the shore at the bidding of King Agamemnon to make sacrifice to the gods. We separated, and the doom of death came to many of us. Nestor I saw at Lesbos, but none other of our friends have I ever since seen. Agamemnon, my own brother, came to his own land, but it would have been happier for him if he had died on the plain of Troy, and if we had left a great barrow heaped above him. For he was slain in his own house, and by one who had married the wife he had left behind. When the Ancient One of the Sea told me of my brother's doom, I sat down upon the sand and wept, and I was minded to live no more, nor to see the light of the sun. And of thy father Telemachus I have told thee, that I myself know, and what was told me of him by the Ancient One of the Sea, how he stays on an island where the nymph Calypso holds him against his will. But where that island lies I do not know. Odysseus is there, and he cannot win back to his own country, seeing that he has no ship and no companions to help him to make his way across the sea. But Odysseus was ever master of devices, and also he is favored greatly by the goddess Pallas Athene. For these reasons, Telemachus, be hopeful that your father will yet reach his own home and country. Chapter 23. Now the goddess Pallas Athene had thought for Telemachus, and she came to him where he lay in the vestibule of Menelaus' house. His comrade Pisistratus was asleep, but Telemachus was wakeful, thinking upon his father. Athene stood before his bed and said to him, Telemachus, no longer shouldst thou wander abroad, for the time has come when thou shouldst return. Come, rouse Menelaus, and let him send thee upon thy way. Then Telemachus woke Pisistratus out of his sleep and told him that it was best that they should be going on their journey. But Pisistratus said, Tarry until it is dawn, Telemachus, when Menelaus will come to us and send us on our way. Then when it was light, King Menelaus came to them. When he heard that they would depart, he told the lady Helen to bid the maids prepare a meal for them. He himself, with Helen his wife, and Megapenthes, his son, went down into his treasure chamber and brought forth for gifts to Telemachus a 2-handled cup and a great mixing bowl of silver. And Helen took out of a chest a beautiful robe that she herself had made and embroidered. They came to Telemachus, where he stood by the chariot with Pisistratus, ready to depart. Then Menelaus gave him the beautiful 2-handled cup that had been a gift to him from the king of the Sidonians. Megapenthes brought up the great bowl of silver and put it in the chariot, and beautiful Helen came to him holding the embroidered robe. I too have a gift, dear child, for thee, she said. Bring this robe home and leave it in thy mother's keeping. I want thee to have it to give to thy bride when thou bringest her into thy father's halls. Then were the horses yoked to the chariot, and Telemachus and Pisistratus bade farewell to Menelaus and Helen, who had treated them so kindly. As they were ready to go, Menelaus poured out of a golden cup wine as an offering to the gods, and as Menelaus poured it out, Telemachus prayed that he might find Odysseus, his father, in his home. Now as he prayed, a bird flew from the right hand and over the horse's head. It was an eagle, and it bore in its claws a goose that belonged to the farmyard. Telemachus asked Menelaus, was this not a sign from Zeus, the greatest of the gods? Then said Helen, hear me now, for I will prophesy from this sign to you. Even as a yonder eagle has flown down from the mountain and killed a goose of the farmyard, so will Odysseus come from far to his home and kill the wooers who are there. May Zeus grant that it be so, said Telemachus. He spoke and lashed the horses, and they sped across the plain. When they came near the city of Pylos, Telemachus spoke to his comrade Pisistratus and said, do not take me past my ship, son of Nestor. Thy good father expects me to return to his house, but I fear that if I should, he, out of friendliness, would be anxious to make me stay many days. But I know that I should now return to Ithaca. The son of Nestor turned the horses towards the sea, and they drove the chariot to where Telemachus' ship was anchored. Then Telemachus gathered his followers, and he bade them take on board the presents that Menelaus and Helen had given him. They did this, and they raised the mast and the sails, and the rowers took their seats on the benches. A breeze came, and the sails took it, and Telemachus and his companions sailed towards home, and all unknown to the youth, his father, Odysseus, was even then nearing his home.